The silence that echoes. The air conditioning at WBGM TV hummed quietly as Marcus Johnson adjusted his tie for the third time in 5 minutes. It was Monday, July 15th, and the heat in Montgomery, Alabama was already promising to be suffocating. At 28, Marcus had built a solid reputation as an investigative journalist at the local station. But today, he felt a different kind of chill in his stomach. "Marcus, are you ready?" Sarah Chen's voice, the executive producer, cut through his thoughts. She was holding a steaming cup of coffee and had that expression Marcus knew well. It meant something big was about to happen. Ready for what exactly? Marcus closed the laptop, where he'd been reviewing his notes on the local economy. "You said it was just routine coverage of the senator's visit." Sarah sighed and looked around the newsroom. The other journalists were busy with their own stories, the murmur of phone conversations and keyboard clicks creating the familiar symphony of a Monday morning. She approached Marcus's desk and lowered her voice. "Change of plans. Frank is going to interview Senator Tuberville this afternoon live on Alabama Speaks. And he's been kind of agitated since yesterday." Marcus had known Frank Whitmore for 3 years, since he started working at WBGM. The veteran host, with his 52 years and graying hair, was an institution in local television. Son of a traditional Montgomery family, Frank had always maintained a respectful but direct tone in his interviews. However, in recent weeks, Marcus had noticed a change in his behavior. "Agitated how?" Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer. He spent the entire weekend researching the senator's record on racial issues. You know how he got after that case last week with the elementary school. Marcus knew exactly what Sarah was talking about. The previous week, a predominantly black elementary school in the senator's district had requested federal funding for urgent repairs to their heating and cooling system. The request had been denied, allegedly due to budget priorities, while a school in a more affluent neighborhood had received approval during the same period for sports facility renovations. Frank Whitmore had grown up in the 1970s and 1980s, experiencing the last echoes of the civil rights era in the South. He rarely talked about personal politics on air, but Marcus knew the host carried deep memories from that period. "Sarah, do you think Frank is going to do something stupid?" Marcus asked, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "I don't know. That's why I want you there, as backup, in case something gets out of control." Marcus nodded and began organizing his equipment. His mind was already working, anticipating possible scenarios. Senator Tommy Tuberville was a controversial figure, a former football coach who had become a politician. His conservative positions and some past statements on racial issues had generated controversy before. At 2:30 p.m., Marcus arrived at WBGM's main studio. The atmosphere was more tense than usual. Technicians were adjusting lights with almost neurotic precision, and he could feel the electricity in the air, that sensation that precedes moments that can change everything. Frank was sitting at his desk, reviewing handwritten notes on a yellow pad. Marcus approached cautiously. "Frank, how are you feeling today?" The veteran host looked up. Marcus could see something different there, a determination that bordered on stubbornness. "Marcus, my boy, have you ever wondered what our role is as journalists? Are we just messengers, or do we have a responsibility to confront injustice when it knocks on our door?" The question caught Marcus off guard. "I believe our role is to inform accurately and impartially." "Impartiality," Frank repeated the word slowly. "And when impartiality means allowing injustice to continue without questions?" Before Marcus could answer, Sarah appeared in the studio. "5 minutes, everyone. The senator is arriving." Marcus positioned himself behind the cameras, where he could observe everything. His heart was beating faster, journalistic intuition telling him he was about to witness something significant. Senator Tuberville entered the studio with the calculated charm of an experienced politician. Tall, broad-shouldered, he greeted the crew with smiles and firm handshakes. He wore an impeccable navy blue suit and a red tie. The patriotic colors were no coincidence. "Frank, my friend, always a pleasure to be on your show," said the senator, settling into the chair across from the host. "Senator, thank you for being here with us," Frank replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Marcus observed the interaction, noting both men's body language. Frank was stiffer than usual, his shoulders tense. The senator, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, as if he were at home. "On air in 3, 2, 1. Good afternoon, Montgomery. I'm Frank Whitmore, and this is Alabama Speaks. Today we have Senator Tommy Tuberville with us to discuss important issues affecting our community." The first 15 minutes proceeded normally. Frank asked questions about the economy, infrastructure, and federal policies. The senator responded with typical talking points, occasionally making jokes that generated polite laughter from the small studio audience. Marcus began to relax. Maybe Sarah had worried for nothing. Then Frank changed his posture. "Senator, I'd like to talk about the situation at Jefferson Davis Elementary School in your district." Marcus saw the senator straighten slightly in his chair. The school's name, one of many in the South that still carried Confederate names, was already a minefield. "Of course, Frank, that's a school that serves an important working community. A working community that is 87% African American, and that requested federal funding for urgent repairs to their air conditioning system. Funding that was denied. Frank, you know we have budget limitations. We can't approve every request. But we could approve funding for new sports courts at Montgomery Prep School, couldn't we? A school where only 12% of students are black, in a neighborhood where the average family income is 3 times higher." Marcus felt the temperature in the studio rise metaphorically. The cameras kept rolling live. There was no way to cut. The senator maintained his political smile, but Marcus could see tension in his eyes. "Frank, budget decisions are complex. You can't simplify them like that." "Senator, with all due respect, your political trajectory shows a consistent pattern of decisions that disadvantage black communities. Not just this school, but also the community center in Selma, the public library in Tuskegee, the hospital in Birmingham. Always the same excuse: budget limitations." The audience was in absolute silence. Marcus could hear his own heart beating. Sarah, beside him, whispered, "My God, what is he doing?" Frank continued, his voice gaining controlled intensity. "Meanwhile, projects in predominantly white and higher-income neighborhoods receive approval. Roads, parks, subsidies. How do you explain this disparity?" "Frank, I represent all Alabamians, regardless of race or—" "Represent?" Frank interrupted, something unthinkable in his nearly 30-year career. "Senator, when was the last time you visited a public school in a black neighborhood? When was the last time you talked to African-American families about their real needs?" Marcus saw the senator struggling to maintain composure. The experienced politician was being cornered by direct questions, without the usual courtesies that allowed evasive answers. "I talk to all my constituents regularly." "Senator," Frank said, his voice now lower but loaded with an intensity that made the entire studio freeze. "I'm going to be direct. Your actions consistently harm African American communities. Your policies perpetuate racial inequalities, and your justifications sound hollow to families who see their children studying in deteriorated buildings while other children in other neighborhoods have the best that public money can buy." The senator tried to respond, but Frank continued. "There's a word for someone who uses their power to systematically harm people based on the color of their skin, and that word, Senator, is racist." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus felt as if time had stopped. The cameras kept rolling. The audience was motionless, some with their mouths open in shock. Sarah beside him had gone completely pale. Senator Tuberville looked directly at the cameras, then at Frank, then back at the cameras. His face had gone from healthy pink to an intense red. And then, completely unexpectedly, he began to speak. But he didn't say what Marcus or anyone in that studio expected. Senator Tuberville remained silent for 10 long seconds, an eternity on live television. Marcus could see the politician's hands trembling slightly as he stared at Frank Whitmore. The studio was so quiet that the air conditioning hum seemed deafening. Finally, the senator spoke, his voice lower than usual. "Frank, that's a very serious accusation, and I made it very seriously, Senator." Marcus watched Tuberville's face go through a series of micro-expressions: anger, confusion, then something that seemed almost relief. The senator slowly removed his lapel microphone and placed it on the table between them. "You know what, Frank? Maybe it's time to have an honest conversation." Sarah whispered urgently into Frank's earpiece, Go to commercial now." But Frank completely ignored the producer. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on the senator. "I'm listening." Tuberville ran his hand through his graying hair, a gesture Marcus recognized as genuinely nervous, very different from the calculated mannerisms he'd shown until then. "I grew up in Camden, Arkansas in the 1960s. My father drove a garbage truck. My mother cleaned houses for wealthy white families." The senator paused, looking at his own hands. "We weren't racist out of malice, Frank. We were racist out of ignorance, out of fear, out of acceptance of what we were told was normal." The audience remained in absolute silence, but Marcus could feel the change in the room's energy. This was no longer a typical political interview. It was transforming into something much deeper and more dangerous. "When I became a football coach," Tuberville continued, "I worked with young people of all colors, and I really believed that had cured me, you know? That working with black athletes, seeing them as champions, that had eliminated any prejudice I might have had." Frank remained quiet, allowing the senator to continue. "But Frank, you're right about the budget decisions. You're right about the pattern." Tuberville raised his eyes, meeting the cameras directly. "And I'm going to tell you why that happens, even when it's not my conscious intention." Marcus felt his breathing accelerate. This was going into completely uncharted territory. "When a funding request reaches my desk, I don't consciously think about race, but I think about political return, about where I can get more votes, more support, more positive visibility." The senator paused long. "And the uncomfortable truth is that investing in black communities doesn't give me the same political return as investing in white and middle-class communities." The confession was so raw and honest that Marcus felt a chill. Sarah beside him was speechless. "It's not that I hate black people, Frank. It's that I prioritize my political career over doing the right thing. And when you put it that way, when you really examine the consequences of that..." Tuberville paused long. "Maybe the word you used is more accurate than I wanted to admit." Frank Whitmore, for the first time in 30 years of career, seemed unsure of what to say. He had prepared for confrontation, for denial, for political evasions. He hadn't prepared for brutal honesty. "Senator," Frank finally said, "what you're saying is extraordinary. But what does this mean in practical terms, for families whose children are sweating in classrooms without adequate air conditioning?" Tuberville looked at the cameras again, then back at Frank. "It means I need to re-examine every decision I make. It means I need to stop thinking only about political strategy and start thinking about real human impact." And Jefferson Davis School. The funding for the air conditioning system will be approved by the end of the week. "I'll personally guarantee that." Marcus could hear low murmurs coming from the audience now. Some seemed positive, others clearly irritated. Frank nodded slowly. "Senator, I appreciate your honesty, but I have to ask, what changed? What made you decide to be so open today? Tuberville smiled sadly. Frank, you called me a racist on live television, and instead of being furious, I felt relief. Because finally someone said out loud what I've been avoiding examining about myself for years. Senator, Frank said, his voice recovering some of its journalistic authority, this kind of self-reflection is rare in politics, but our viewers deserve to know, how can they be sure this isn't just another political maneuver? The question was fair, and Marcus could see that Tuberville was considering it seriously. Frank, I can't provide guarantees. I can only say that I intend to do differently, and I'm going to start by being completely transparent about my decision-making process. I'm going to publish online all the funding requests I receive, along with my decision and justification for each one. That's unprecedented for a senator. Maybe it's time to establish new precedents. Marcus looked around the studio. The technical crew was clearly tense. No one knew if this was a historic moment or a developing disaster. Sarah was on the phone, probably talking to the station's management. Frank looked directly at the cameras. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed something extraordinary. An honest discussion about race, power, and responsibility between a host and an American senator. We're going to take a break, and we'll be right back. The red light on the cameras went out, and immediately the studio exploded into activity. Sarah ran to the host's table, while technicians began whispering urgently among themselves. Marcus observed Tuberville, who remained seated, looking simultaneously exhausted and relieved. Frank was motionless, clearly processing what had just happened. "Marcus!" Sarah called. "I need you here now!" Marcus approached, and Sarah pulled him to a corner of the studio. "Management is going crazy," she whispered. "They want to know if we should continue live or end the program. What do you think?" "I think we just witnessed real journalism. But I also think this could destroy our station if we don't handle it the right way." Marcus looked back at Frank and Tuberville, who were now talking in low voices. "Sarah, this is bigger than our station. This is about responsibility, about truth, and about our ability to continue broadcasting if we get sued for defamation or lose all our advertisers." It was a valid concern, but Marcus felt they had crossed a line from which there was no return. "Let's continue. But we need to be prepared for the consequences." Sarah nodded, though her expression remained worried. 15 seconds, everyone." When the cameras went back on air, Frank seemed to have recovered his professional composure, though Marcus could detect a different intensity in his eyes. "We're back to Alabama Speaks. Senator Tuberville, before the break, you made specific commitments about changes in your political approach. Can you elaborate on how you intend to implement these changes?" The rest of the interview proceeded relatively conventionally, with Tuberville detailing some specific plans and Frank asking follow-up questions. But Marcus knew the crucial moment had already passed. When the program ended, Tuberville remained in the studio for a few minutes, talking with Frank off-camera. Marcus couldn't hear the complete conversation, but caught fragments. "Never thought I'd say this publicly. Hope you can forgive me in time." As soon as the senator left, Frank approached Marcus. "Marcus, I need to talk to you, in private." They went to Frank's small office, away from the newsroom bustle. Frank closed the door and sat heavily in his chair. "Marcus, I may have just destroyed my career," Frank said, running his hands over his face. "And maybe yours too, by association. Frank, what you did today was courageous journalism. You forced a politician to be honest about fundamental issues. Or I crossed a line I shouldn't have crossed, directly accusing a senator of racism live without definitive proof." Marcus chose his words carefully. "The proof was in his voting patterns, in the budget decisions, in the facts you cited. You didn't make anything up." Frank nodded slowly. "But still, Marcus, My phone hasn't stopped ringing since the program ended. I already have lawyers, political advisors, and who knows who else looking for me. And what are you going to tell them? Frank looked out his office window, watching Montgomery's afternoon traffic. I'm going to tell them I finally did the job I was hired to do. I'm going to tell them I confronted power with truth, even if it has consequences. Marcus felt a wave of respect for the older man. Frank, you know I'll support you, no matter what happens. I know, Marcus. And I might need you more than I imagine in the coming days. As if on cue, Sarah knocked on the door and entered without waiting for an answer. Her face was pale. We have a problem, she said. Actually, we have several problems. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the station at 6:30 a.m., 2 hours before his normal time. He hadn't been able to sleep after 4 a.m. when he stopped receiving phone notifications about the interview. The video of the confrontation between Frank and Senator Tuberville had gone viral on social media, with clips being shared millions of times. WBGM's reception was unusually busy for such an early hour. Marcus recognized at least 3 reporters from competing stations waiting in the visitor area, plus a man in a suit who definitely looked like a lawyer. Marcus, good thing you came early. Sarah appeared beside him, holding 2 steaming coffee cups and looking even more tense than the day before. Mr. Patterson wants to talk to you in 15 minutes. James Patterson was WBGM's president and CEO, a man Marcus had seen in person only 3 times in 3 years of work. If Patterson wanted an urgent meeting, it meant the situation was even more serious than Marcus imagined. How's Frank? Didn't come in today. Said he's dealing with legal issues. Sarah made air quotes. Marcus, I need to tell you some things before the meeting. They headed to a small conference room, away from the main newsroom activity. Since yesterday at 6 p.m., we've lost 6 major advertisers, Sarah began, consulting her notes. Sullivan Dealership, Central Community Bank, Fresh Market Supermarket Chain, Montgomery Family Health Clinic, Peterson and Associates Real Estate, and Heritage Furniture Store. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. These advertisers represented at least 40% of the station's advertising revenue. On the other hand, Sarah continued, we've received calls from 17 new potential advertisers, including some companies from Birmingham and even Atlanta, wanting to associate with our journalistic courage. That's unexpected and complicated, because some of the interested advertisers are explicitly progressive, which could alienate our traditional audience even more. Marcus understood the dilemma. WBGM had always maintained a relatively neutral position, serving a diverse but conservative community. Now, inadvertently, they had positioned themselves on a specific side of the political spectrum. There's more, Sarah said, her voice getting more tense. We've received 847 emails since yesterday. I read them all. About 60% are negative, some extremely hostile. Several veiled threats against Frank, some against the station in general. And the other 40%, enthusiastic support. People saying someone finally had the courage to tell the truth, that this is the kind of journalism the country needs. Sarah paused. The problem is that the support emails come mainly from outside Alabama. Our local viewers are, for the most part, furious. Marcus processed the information. In a democracy, courageous journalism should be applauded. But at a local station dependent on local audience and advertisers, courage could be synonymous with commercial suicide. Sarah, where are you personally positioned on this story? She looked directly at him. Marcus, I've been working in journalism for 15 years. I've seen a lot of cowardice, a lot of complicity with power. What Frank did yesterday was the first time I felt proud of my work in a long time, even with the financial consequences, especially because of the financial consequences. It means it mattered, that it had real impact. Before Marcus could respond, someone knocked on the conference room door. It was Janet, Patterson's assistant. Marcus, Mr. Patterson is ready to see you. Patterson's office was on the top floor of the station building with a panoramic view of Montgomery. James Patterson was 58, with well-groomed white hair and the appearance of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. He wasn't alone. A younger man in an expensive grey suit was sitting in one of the leather armchairs. "Marcus, thank you for coming. This is David Hendricks, our legal consultant." Marcus greeted both and sat in the chair indicated by Patterson. "Marcus, I'm going to be direct," Patterson began. "Yesterday's interview put our station in a very delicate position. We need to understand exactly how we got to this point. Sir, may I ask specifically what your concerns are?" Hendricks leaned forward. "Marcus, there's a real possibility of a defamation lawsuit. Calling someone a racist on television, even a public politician, can be considered defamatory if it can't be substantiated with irrefutable evidence. But Frank presented specific evidence. The voting patterns, the budget decisions. Evidence that suggests trends but doesn't prove conscious discriminatory intent," Hendricks interrupted. "It's an important legal distinction." Patterson drummed his fingers on the desk. "Marcus, I need to know, did you have prior knowledge of Frank's intentions yesterday? Did you know he planned to make that specific accusation?" The question was a potential trap. Marcus could try to distance himself from Frank to protect his own position, or he could assume shared responsibility. "Mr. Patterson, Frank was visibly upset about the Jefferson Davis school issue. Sarah asked me to be present as backup in case something got out of control. But no, I didn't know specifically that he would use the word racist. But did you support his decision?" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "I supported the decision to ask difficult questions about important issues. Confronting political power is a fundamental part of journalism." Hendricks made some notes. "Marcus, you were present when the senator made his confessions. In your professional opinion, were those admissions spontaneous or did they seem coerced?" "Completely spontaneous. Actually, Frank seemed as surprised as anyone in the studio." Patterson stood up and walked to the window. "Marcus, I'm going to be honest. Half the board wants to fire Frank immediately and make a public apology. The other half thinks we should support our journalist and take the position of defenders of truth. And which side is winning? There's no winner yet. But I need to make a decision by the end of the day." Patterson turned to face Marcus. "Your opinion matters in this decision. You're respected here, you have credibility with the staff, and frankly, you're one of the few black employees in a leadership position. Your perspective on racial issues carries weight." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility. His answer could determine not only Frank's future, but the station's direction as a whole. "Mr. Patterson, with all due respect, this shouldn't be a decision based only on financial or legal considerations. It should be a decision about what kind of journalism we want to practice." Elaborate. Frank did exactly what a journalist should do. Confronted power with facts, forced a politician to answer for his actions, and discovered an important truth in the process. The senator didn't deny the pattern of behavior. In fact, he confirmed it and explained the logic behind it. Patterson nodded slowly. "But Marcus, we need to be practical. If we lose enough advertisers, there won't be a station to practice journalism of any kind." "I understand that. But if we abandon Frank now, if we apologize for doing real journalism, what message are we sending? What kind of journalists will we be in the future?" Hendricks interrupted. "Marcus, there's a difference between supporting investigative journalism and supporting direct personal accusations. And there's a difference between unfounded accusations and factual observations about behavior patterns," Marcus responded firmly. "Frank didn't invent data. He interpreted public patterns of voting and decision-making." Patterson returned to his chair. "Marcus, I need your honest assessment. If we support Frank, can the station survive the consequences?" Marcus took a deep breath. "Sir, I can't guarantee financial survival. But I can guarantee that if we abandon Frank, we'll lose something much more important than money. We'll lose our journalistic integrity. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with Hendricks detailing legal risks and Patterson exploring financial scenarios. When Marcus finally left the office, he felt mentally exhausted. Back in the newsroom, he found the atmosphere completely transformed. Journalists from other stations were interviewing WBGM staff, while the regular team tried to maintain their normal routines. Marcus noticed that some colleagues looked at him differently, some with admiration, others with a new caution. "Marcus!" His colleague Jennifer's voice reached him through the bustle. Jennifer had worked at WBGM for 8 years and mainly covered education issues. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" They isolated themselves near the coffee machine, away from the visiting reporters' cameras. "Marcus, I'm worried," Jennifer said in a low voice. "Some people here are saying Frank went too far, that this could hurt all of us." "And what do you think?" "I think Frank did what many of us didn't have the courage to do. But I also have 2 daughters and need this job." Jennifer paused. "There's a rumor circulating that some employees are considering a petition asking for Frank's dismissal." Marcus felt a pang of disappointment. "Jennifer, would you sign such a petition?" "I don't know. Honestly, I'm torn." She looked around nervously. "Marcus, you who are black, who have a perspective that many of us don't have, was what Frank did right?" The question was loaded with implications. Marcus knew his answer would circulate through the newsroom within hours. "Jennifer, Frank told a truth that many people know, but no one has the courage to verbalize. Whether that was right or not, each person needs to decide for themselves. But for me, living in a society where these truths can't be told is much more dangerous than living with the consequences of telling them." Around noon, Marcus received an unexpected call. It was Frank Whitmore. "Marcus, can you meet me?" "Not at the station. There's a small cafe on Dexter Avenue near Martin Luther King's church. Let's say in half an hour?" The Dexter Deli was a modest establishment that mainly served downtown workers. Frank was already there when Marcus arrived, sitting at a corner table wearing sunglasses and a cap. A transparent attempt at disguise that wasn't working very well. Several people had recognized him and were whispering among themselves. "Frank, how are you holding up?" Frank removed his sunglasses, revealing red eyes from fatigue. "Marcus, I didn't sleep last night. My phone rang until I turned it off at 3 a.m. I have 3 law firms looking for me for representation, 2 agents wanting to turn me into a brand, and a New York editor interested in a book about courageous journalism in the South. That sounds promising? And I also have a real death threat being investigated by the FBI, and my wife is considering taking our daughters to stay with her sister in Atlanta until things calm down." Marcus felt the real weight of consequences for the first time. "Frank, are you sorry?" Frank was silent for a long moment, stirring the coffee cooling in front of him. "Marcus, you know this city's history. Montgomery was where Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus. It was from here that Martin Luther King Jr. led the bus boycott. It was here that the civil rights movement gained national momentum." "Yes." And do you know where we were during all that history?" "Us, local journalists." Frank paused bitterly. "We were silent. Some out of fear, others out of convenience, many out of real prejudice. But mainly, we were silent." Marcus began to understand where Frank was going with this reasoning. "So no, Marcus, I'm not sorry. I'm scared. I'm worried about my family. I'm nervous about the future. But I'm not sorry for finally having said a truth that needed to be said. Frank, what are you going to do if Patterson decides to fire you?" "I'll accept the consequences, but I'll also continue doing journalism, even if it's from a podcast in my basement." Frank smiled for the first time. Marcus, yesterday something changed. Not just with me, but with the national conversation about these issues. You saw social media, the comments, the reactions. Marcus had seen. The video was being discussed on national news programs, analyzed by political commentators, debated in universities. The Tuberville response was trending on Twitter. But Frank, this is also polarizing people even more. Maybe. But polarization around truth is better than false unity around lies. They talked for another hour, with Frank detailing some of the reactions he'd received. He had been contacted by civil rights activists, by other journalists wanting support, and surprisingly, by several white Southerners who said they'd had similar reflections about their own unconscious prejudice. Marcus, can I ask you a favor? Sure. If Patterson decides to keep me, great, but if he decides to fire me, I want you to continue this conversation. Not confrontationally, but consistently. Ask the difficult questions. Don't let this be just an isolated moment. Marcus nodded, knowing he was making a commitment that could define the rest of his career. When he returned to the station at 3 p.m., he found a scene of controlled chaos. The reception was full of people, reporters, curious onlookers, and at least one group carrying signs. Marcus managed to read one of them: "We support Frank Whitmore. Truth is not defamation." Sarah intercepted him before he could reach the elevator. "Marcus, Patterson wants to talk to the entire staff at 4 p.m. He's going to announce his decision about Frank. Any indication of which way he chose? None, but he spent the last hour on the phone with important people, politicians, advertisers, other station directors." Sarah paused. "Marcus, whatever the decision, this is going to change our station forever." The meeting took place in WBGM's main auditorium, with all 47 employees present. Patterson looked like he had aged years in a single day, but his posture was straight and determined. "Colleagues, we all know why we're here. Yesterday, our station broadcast an interview that generated national controversy. Today, I need to announce how we're going to proceed." Marcus felt his breathing accelerate. "First, I want to make clear that Frank Whitmore acted without prior approval for his specific accusations against Senator Tuberville. This violated our normal protocols." A murmur went through the auditorium. "However," Patterson continued, "after carefully reviewing the facts presented by Frank, consulting with our legal advisors, and most importantly, reflecting on our journalistic responsibility to this community, we have decided to fully support Frank Whitmore and his journalistic coverage." The auditorium exploded in a mixture of applause and murmurs of disagreement. Patterson raised his hand, asking for silence. This decision was not made lightly. "We lost advertisers, faced criticism, and may face legal consequences, but we also gained national respect, new supporters, and most importantly, maintained our journalistic integrity." Marcus felt a wave of relief and pride. "Frank will return to work tomorrow. We will implement new protocols for similar situations in the future, but our position is clear. WBGM is committed to courageous and honest journalism, even when it's uncomfortable." After the meeting, Marcus was approached by several colleagues. Some congratulated him for having the courage to support Frank. Others expressed concern about the station's future, but one conversation stood out. Tom Bradley, sports reporter for 12 years at WBGM, approached Marcus in the parking lot. "Marcus, can I ask you a personal question?" "Sure, Tom." "Do you really think Frank did the right thing, or are you supporting him because you're black and feel obligated?" The question was too direct to be offensive. It was too honest for that. "Tom, I support Frank because he did journalism, because he confronted power with facts. My race gives me a perspective on those facts, but it doesn't determine my professional position on the journalistic value of what he did." Tom nodded slowly. "I need to be honest with you, Marcus. I grew up here in the South, And some of the things Frank said yesterday, they made me think about things I never wanted to examine about myself. And how does that make you feel? Uncomfortable, but maybe discomfort is necessary sometimes. Driving home that night, Marcus reflected on the last 36 hours. A single direct question from Frank had triggered an avalanche of consequences that would continue for weeks, maybe months. But it had also created a space for honest conversations that rarely happened in public. His phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Hello? Marcus Johnson? My name is Robert Chen. I'm a producer at CNN. I'd like to talk to you about the possibility of participating in a national panel on journalism and racial responsibility. Marcus smiled. The waves from Frank's interview continued to spread, creating new opportunities and new challenges. I'm interested, Mr. Chen. Let's talk. 3 weeks after the interview that changed everything, Marcus was in his apartment preparing for his first appearance on national television. CNN's panel, Journalism in the Age of Difficult Truth, would be broadcast live at 8 p.m. Eastern, and Marcus felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. Marcus's apartment reflected his meticulous personality. Journalism books organized by theme, framed diplomas from the University of Alabama, and photographs from important moments in his career. That morning, he had added a new one, a photo of him and Frank after receiving the Journalistic Courage Award from the National Association of Black Journalists. His phone rang. It was his mother, calling from Birmingham. Marcus, honey, I saw you're going to be on CNN tonight. Your father and I are going to watch. We're so proud. Thanks, Mom. I'm nervous. You should be, but not for the reason you think. Dorothy Johnson's voice had that maternal quality that always calmed him. You're nervous because this matters, because you have something important to say. His mother was right. The last 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of activity. WBGM had not only survived the initial controversy, but was thriving. Local viewership had gradually returned, especially after Frank started a weekly series called Difficult Conversations, where he interviewed Montgomery residents about racial issues honestly and respectfully. More surprising still, Senator Tuberville had kept his promises. The funding for Jefferson Davis School had been approved, and he had implemented the budget transparency system he'd promised. His approval ratings among black voters had increased slightly, though they remained low. Marcus. His mother's voice brought him back to the present. Sorry, Mom. I was thinking about what you're going to say tonight, about how we got here, about whether we really changed anything or just created more noise. Dorothy Johnson paused. Son, do you remember when you were 8 years old and asked me why some people were mean to other people who had different colored skin? Marcus vaguely remembered. I told you it wasn't because people were bad, but because they were afraid of difficult conversations, and that your job in life would be to make those conversations less scary. She paused. Seems like you're doing exactly that. After hanging up, Marcus reviewed his notes one last time. The panel would include him, Frank, participating via link from Montgomery, a journalism professor from Northwestern, and a conservative political commentator from Washington. The central topic would be the limits of confrontational journalism. At 7:30 p.m., Marcus was at CNN's Birmingham affiliate studio, adjusting his lapel microphone. The producer, a young man named Kevin, was testing the video connections. Marcus, you look calm for someone who's never been on national television before. On the outside, maybe, Marcus replied with a smile. Remember what we talked about keeping responses concise? National television moves faster than local journalism. Marcus nodded. In recent weeks, he had learned a lot about the difference between local and national coverage. Locally, there was room for nuance, for developed explanations. Nationally, everything reduced to sound bites and quick impressions. On air in 30 seconds, Kevin announced. The red light came on, and Marcus found himself looking directly at a camera while host Dana Bash opened the program. Good evening. I'm Dana Bash, and this is a special edition of Inside Politics. 3 weeks ago, a televised confrontation in Montgomery, Alabama, between a local host and an American senator generated a national conversation about the limits of journalism, racial responsibility, and the nature of truth in American politics. The screen split, showing Marcus in Birmingham, Frank in Montgomery, Professor Patricia Williams in Chicago, and commentator Richard Hawley in Washington. Frank Whitmore, I'll start with you. 3 weeks later, do you regret calling Senator Tuberville a racist on live television? Frank, who had gained considerable confidence in recent weeks, responded without hesitation. Dana, I don't regret confronting a documented pattern of decisions that consistently harmed African American communities. Whether that constitutes racism is a question each viewer needs to decide for themselves. But using specifically the word racist, didn't that go beyond the bounds of objective journalism? Dana, there's a difference between objectivity and neutrality. Objectivity means presenting accurate facts. Neutrality can mean pretending that all sides of an issue have equal merit, even when they don't. Richard Hawley interjected, Frank, with all due respect, accusing an elected senator of racism based on interpretations of voting patterns is exactly the kind of activist journalism that's destroying public trust in the media. Marcus felt it was his turn to speak. Richard, may I respond to that? Because I think there's a fundamental confusion about what happened in that interview. Go ahead, Marcus. Frank didn't start with a conclusion and look for evidence to support it. He presented a factual pattern of decisions and questioned how to explain that pattern. The senator's response was revealing. He didn't deny the pattern, he explained the logic behind it. Professor Williams agreed. That's a crucial point. The journalistic value of the interview wasn't in the initial accusation, but in the honest response it provoked. But, Hawley persisted, this creates a dangerous precedent. If journalists can label politicians based on interpretations of their voting records, where does it end? Marcus had anticipated this question. Richard, journalists have always interpreted voting records. The difference is, we usually do it indirectly, through euphemisms and coded language. Frank was simply direct. Dana Bash intervened. Marcus, you've faced criticism for supporting Frank. Some said your position was based more on racial identity than journalistic principles. How do you respond? The question was delicate, and Marcus chose his words carefully. Dana, my experience as a black man gives me a perspective on racial issues that informs my journalism, but I support Frank for the same reasons I'd support any journalist who confronted power with facts, because that's what journalists should do. But don't you think that perspective might compromise your objectivity? Marcus felt a pang of irritation, but kept his voice controlled. Dana, for decades, newsrooms were dominated by white men, and we never questioned whether their perspectives compromised their objectivity. Diversity of perspectives improves journalism, it doesn't compromise it. Frank added, if I may add something, Marcus has challenged me several times over the years when he thought I was being too soft on politicians. Good journalistic conscience has no color. The debate continued for another 20 minutes, touching on topics from public trust in media to the role of local journalism in national conversations. Marcus felt his confidence growing as the discussion progressed. Near the end, Dana Bash asked a question that caught him by surprise. Marcus, if you could go back in time, would you do anything differently that day? Marcus paused, genuinely thinking about the question. Dana, I would push Frank to be even more prepared for the consequences. Not because he was wrong, but because moments like that are too important to be left to chance. Frank, last word. just this. Real journalism is sometimes uncomfortable. If our work doesn't occasionally bother powerful people, we're probably not doing our job adequately. When the cameras turned off, Marcus felt a mixture of exhaustion and euphoria. He had navigated his first major national test reasonably well. His phone immediately started ringing. The first call was from Sarah. "Marcus, you were fantastic. We watched at the station and everyone was applauding." The second was from his mother. "I'm so proud, son. You represented your family and your profession with dignity." The third surprised him. It was a number with a Washington, D.C. area code. "Marcus Johnson." "Yes." "My name is Catherine Rodriguez. I'm executive editor at the Washington Post. I'd like to talk to you about a position we have available on our national politics team." Marcus felt his heart accelerate. The Washington Post. It was an opportunity he'd dreamed of since college. "I'm interested in hearing more, Ms. Rodriguez." "Great. Can you be in Washington next Tuesday for an interview?" Driving back to Montgomery that night, Marcus processed how quickly his life was changing. 3 weeks ago, he was a respected but relatively unknown local journalist. Now he was receiving job offers from national newspapers, but he also thought about what he would leave behind. WBGM had become more than a job. It was a family. And there was an unfinished project in Montgomery. Frank's difficult conversations were really changing dialogues in the community, and Marcus knew his presence contributed to that. The next morning, he met Frank for coffee at the same place where they'd talked 3 weeks earlier. The atmosphere was noticeably different. Several people greeted Frank amicably, and no one seemed to be whispering about them. "So, Washington Post," Frank said with a smile. "I can't say I'm surprised." "How did you know?" "Sarah mentioned you received an interesting call last night, and besides, you have that look of someone being pulled in different directions." Marcus stirred his coffee. "Frank, I feel like I'd be abandoning the work in the middle, the difficult conversations, what we're building here. Marcus, you've already done your part here, more than your part. And what we're building in Montgomery will be stronger if there are voices like yours in Washington, influencing national conversations. But don't you think there's something to be said for staying and doing the difficult work at the local level?" Frank was thoughtful. "There's value in both. But Marcus, you have an opportunity to influence conversations that affect not just Montgomery, but the entire country. It would be selfish of me to ask you to give that up." They talked for another hour, with Frank sharing reflections on his own career and the choices he'd made. He had had opportunities to move to larger markets over the years, but had always chosen to stay in Montgomery. "The difference," Frank explained, "is that my opportunities were about personal advancement. Yours is about impact. That's an important distinction." That afternoon, Marcus called Catherine Rodriguez and accepted the interview in Washington. But he also made a decision. Regardless of what happened with the Post opportunity, he would finish his current project, an investigative series on educational disparities in rural Alabama. The trip to Washington on Tuesday was a surreal experience. Marcus had never been to the nation's capital in a professional context. The Washington Post building on K Street was imposing, filled with the history of great journalistic moments. The interview lasted 3 hours, involving multiple people, from senior editors to other reporters on the politics team. Questions ranged from technical, how he would approach covering national campaigns, to philosophical, the role of journalism in a polarized democracy. "Marcus," Catherine Rodriguez said near the end, "your experience in Montgomery is precisely the kind of perspective we need here. National journalism sometimes becomes too distant from the local realities that affect real people. Ms. Rodriguez, may I ask a question?" "Of course." "How do you see the balance between traditional objectivity and the kind of confrontational journalism that Frank and I practice?" She smiled. "That's exactly the right question. We're redefining what objectivity means in 2024. It doesn't mean false neutrality, but rather accuracy, honesty, and courage to confront power when necessary. On the flight back to Montgomery, Marcus reflected on the opportunity. The post offered not just prestige and better salary, but the chance to influence national conversations. At the same time, there was something powerful about local work, seeing directly the impact of his reporting on real communities. When he landed in Montgomery, he found a message from Sarah asking him to call urgently. "Marcus, where have you been? We have a situation here." "What kind of situation?" "Senator Tuberville wants to do another interview with Frank. Live, tomorrow night." Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline. "Why?" "He says he wants to continue the conversation. But Marcus, there are rumors he's planning something. Maybe a confrontation, maybe a public apology. Nobody knows. And Frank is willing." "He is. But he wants you there. As a partner, not just as backup." Marcus looked out the airport window, seeing the city of Montgomery stretch under the Alabama sky. In 24 hours, he would need to decide between the future in Washington and finishing what he'd started at home. "Sarah, tell Frank I'll be there." On the morning of the second interview, Marcus arrived at WBGM earlier than anyone on staff. The building was silent, just the hum of air conditioning and the distant noise of Montgomery's morning traffic. He needed time to process everything that had happened in recent weeks and mentally prepare for what could be another defining moment. Sitting at his desk, Marcus opened his laptop and began reviewing all the developments since the first interview. Senator Tuberville had kept his initial promises. Funding for Jefferson Davis School had been approved and repairs had already begun. The budget transparency system was working, with all decisions being published online with detailed justifications. But there were also signs that the senator was facing significant political pressure. Some Republican colleagues had publicly criticized his capitulation to the progressive agenda, and conservative groups were questioning their support for his re-election. "You're here early today." Frank's voice surprised him. The veteran host was standing at the newsroom entrance, holding 2 steaming coffee cups. "Couldn't sleep much. You?" Frank approached and handed one of the cups to Marcus. "Me neither. I spent all night wondering what Tuberville really wants with this second interview. Do you have any theories?" "A few. He might want to undo what he said in the first interview. He might want to confront us about the consequences, or..." Frank paused. "He might genuinely want to continue the conversation productively." Marcus took a sip of coffee, appreciating the strong flavor. "Frank, regardless of what happens today, you know this changed everything, right? Not just for us, but for local journalism, for conversations about race, for politics." "Yes, I feel that too. Sometimes I wonder if we were ready for this responsibility." Before Marcus could respond, Sarah arrived, looking even more tense than in previous weeks. "Good, you're both here. We have an important development." She sat at Marcus's desk. "I got a call from the Senator's Chief of Staff 20 minutes ago. They want to make some changes to today's format." "What kind of changes?" Marcus asked. "They want it to be more of a conversation than an interview, less confrontational, more collaborative. And they want you, Marcus, to be on camera as a co-host with Frank." Frank raised his eyebrows. "That's unusual." "It's unprecedented," Sarah corrected. "I've never seen a politician request changes like this. It's almost like they want to create a safe space for dialogue." Marcus felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. Being on camera as co-host would be a significant step up professionally, but it would also mean sharing responsibility for whatever happened. "What did you tell them?" Frank asked. "That I'd discuss it with you both." "But Marcus, if you do this, there's no going back. You'll be as much a part of this story as Frank." Marcus looked at Frank, who nodded encouragingly. "I think it's the right move. This conversation is bigger than any one person." Okay, Marcus said. I'll do it. The rest of the morning was spent preparing for the new format. Instead of Frank alone at the host desk, they would have a round table set up with Frank, Marcus, and Senator Tuberville. The atmosphere would be more like a panel discussion than a traditional political interview. At 2 p.m., Marcus was in makeup for the first time in his career, having powder applied to prevent shine under the studio lights. The makeup artist, a woman named Gloria who had worked at WBGM for 15 years, chatted while she worked. Never thought I'd see the day when we'd have two black journalists sharing a table with a senator from Alabama, she said with a smile. Times really are changing. Marcus realized she was right. The visual of two black men interviewing a white Southern senator would be powerful regardless of what was actually said. At 3:30, Senator Tuberville arrived, but this time without the political entourage that had accompanied him 3 weeks earlier. He looked more casual, still professional, but less formal. Instead of the navy suit, he wore a gray jacket and khakis. "Frank, Marcus," he said, shaking hands with both men. "Thank you for agreeing to this format. I think it'll serve everyone better." Up close, Marcus could see that the senator looked older than 3 weeks ago. The stress of the aftermath was evident in the lines around his eyes and a slight slump in his shoulders. "Senator," Marcus said, "before we go on air, can I ask why you wanted to do this again?" Tuberville sat down at the round table and looked directly at Marcus. "Because I've spent 3 weeks living with what I said, and I realize that confession without action is just performance. I want to talk about what I'm actually doing differently." Frank leaned forward. "And what are you doing differently?" "That's what I want to discuss on air. But I'll say this. I've discovered that being honest about your own prejudices is just the beginning. The hard work is changing the systems that allowed those prejudices to flourish." At 4 p.m., they went live. The new format felt more intimate, more conversational. Instead of the adversarial setup of 3 weeks ago, this felt like 3 people genuinely trying to understand complex issues. "Good afternoon, Montgomery. I'm Frank Whitmore, joined today by my colleague Marcus Johnson, and we're here with Senator Tommy Tuberville for a follow-up to our conversation 3 weeks ago. Senator, you requested this format. Why?" Tuberville folded his hands on the table. "Frank, Marcus, 3 weeks ago, I admitted to some uncomfortable truths about myself and my decision-making process. Since then, I've had time to reflect not just on what I said, but on what it means in practice." Marcus jumped in. "Senator, you've fulfilled some of the commitments you made in that interview, the Jefferson Davis School funding, the transparency system, but you've also faced criticism from your own party. How do you balance those pressures?" "Marcus, that's exactly what I want to talk about, because I think it illustrates a larger problem in American politics." Tuberville paused. "When I approved that school funding, I got calls from 3 Republican colleagues asking if I'd lost my mind. When I implemented the transparency system, a major donor threatened to pull support unless I stopped this virtue signaling." Frank nodded. "And how did you respond?" "I told them that if transparency and ensuring equal treatment for all constituents is virtue signaling, then we have a serious problem with our understanding of public service." Marcus was impressed by the directness of the response. "Senator, that sounds like you've made a fundamental shift in how you approach your role." "I have, and it's been educational." Tuberville smiled slightly. "I've spent the last 3 weeks visiting schools, community centers, and neighborhoods that I honestly hadn't been to in years. I've been listening to people I hadn't really heard before." "What did you learn?" Frank asked. "I learned that my conception of my district was incomplete. I was representing the people who came to my events, contributed to my campaigns, and wrote letters to my office. But those people were predominantly white and middle class or above." Tuberville paused. I wasn't representing everyone. Marcus leaned forward. And how are you changing that? Practically. I've hired new staff specifically to do outreach in communities I'd neglected. I've scheduled regular office hours in different neighborhoods, not just the country club circuit. And I'm looking at every decision through a new lens. Who benefits and who is harmed? Frank asked. Senator, that's a significant change in approach. But some people might be skeptical. How do they know this isn't just political calculation after being called out publicly? Tuberville was quiet for a moment. Frank, I can't prove my motivations to anyone, but I can point to results. In 3 weeks, I've approved funding for 6 projects in predominantly black communities that had been sitting on my desk for months. I've met with community leaders I'd never spoken to before. And I've discovered that serving all my constituents actually makes me a better senator. Marcus felt the conversation reaching a deeper level. Senator, you mentioned discovering prejudices you weren't aware of. Can you elaborate on that? Marcus, I thought because I coached black athletes, because I worked with diverse teams, that I'd overcome any racial bias I might have had. But what I discovered is that I could compartmentalize. I could see individual black people as worthy, while still unconsciously viewing black communities as less deserving of resources. That's a distinction many people struggle to understand, Frank noted. And it's a dangerous one, because it allows you to feel good about yourself while still perpetuating systemic problems. Tuberville looked directly at the camera. I've learned that overcoming prejudice isn't a one-time decision. It's a daily choice to examine your assumptions and correct course when you find them wanting. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering specific policy changes Tuberville was implementing, the political challenges he was facing, and the broader implications for how politicians engage with diverse constituencies. Near the end, Marcus asked what he felt was the most important question. Senator, what would you say to other politicians who might be watching this and recognizing similar patterns in their own decision-making? Tuberville thought carefully before responding. I'd say that being honest about your own biases is terrifying but liberating, and that the cost of that honesty, political pressure, criticism from allies, uncomfortable self-examination, is far less than the cost of perpetuating systems that harm people. When the cameras stopped rolling, there was a different feeling in the studio than 3 weeks ago. Instead of the tension and shock of the first interview, there was something that felt almost like resolution. Senator, Frank said as they removed their microphones, I have to say, this was not what I expected. What did you expect? Honestly, I thought you might try to walk back what you said before, or attack us for the consequences you faced. Tuberville smiled. Frank, the consequences I faced were nothing compared to the consequences experienced by people who've been harmed by policies I supported or funding I denied. Getting criticized by colleagues is a small price to pay for doing the right thing. As the senator left, Marcus and Frank sat in the studio, processing what had just happened. Marcus, Frank said, I think we just witnessed something rare in politics, genuine growth in real time. Do you think it's sustainable, or will political pressure eventually force him back into old patterns? I don't know. But I think we created a framework for accountability. The transparency system, the public commitments he made, those create ongoing pressure to follow through. That evening, Marcus met with Sarah to discuss the long-term implications of both interviews. Marcus, you know this changes your trajectory significantly, she said. You're no longer just a local journalist. You're part of a national conversation about journalism, race, and political accountability. I know. It's both exciting and overwhelming. Have you decided about the Washington Post offer? Marcus had been thinking about this all day. Sarah, I've realized something. The work we're doing here, the conversations Frank and I are facilitating, this is the kind of journalism that changes things. Washington is important, but the real impact happens at the local level. So you're staying? I'm staying, at least for now. There's more work to do here. That night, Marcus called Catherine Rodriguez at the Washington Post to decline their offer, explaining that he felt called to continue the work he'd started in Montgomery. She was disappointed but understanding and left the door open for future opportunities. A week later, Frank and Marcus were at their usual coffee spot when Frank brought up something that had been on his mind. "Marcus, do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't asked that question 3 weeks ago? Every day, but I think it was inevitable that someone would ask it eventually. The pattern was too clear, the disparities too obvious. Maybe, but I think timing matters. If I'd asked it 2 years ago or 2 years from now, the response might have been completely different." Marcus nodded. The country was ready for that conversation. We just provided the platform. And now? Now we keep having the conversation. We keep asking the difficult questions. We keep holding power accountable. Marcus smiled. And we hope other journalists in other places find the courage to do the same. 6 months later, Marcus received a call that surprised him. It was from a television producer in Atlanta. "Mr. Johnson, we've been following your work in Montgomery. We're developing a regional program focused on in-depth political coverage across the South. We'd like you and Frank to host it." It was an opportunity to scale their impact while staying true to their local roots. After discussing it with Frank and Sarah, they decided to pursue it. A year after the interview that changed everything, Marcus stood in a new studio in Atlanta, preparing for the first episode of Southern Conversations, a program that would bring the Montgomery model of confrontational but respectful journalism to a regional audience. Frank, now his co-host, was adjusting his tie. "Ready for this, partner?" Marcus looked around the studio, thinking about the journey that had brought them here. Ready to keep asking the difficult questions, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. As the red light came on and they went live for the first time from Atlanta, Marcus felt the same mix of nervousness and determination he'd felt that day in Montgomery. But now he also felt something else, the confidence that comes from knowing you're doing work that matters. Good evening and welcome to Southern Conversations. I'm Marcus Johnson. And I'm Frank Whitmore. Tonight, we're asking the questions that need to be asked even when they're uncomfortable to hear. The silence that had echoed through Montgomery had become a voice that would reach across the South, creating space for the difficult conversations that democracy requires. And in newsrooms across the region, young journalists were learning that sometimes the most important questions are the ones that make powerful people uncomfortable. The story that began with one confrontational interview had become something larger, a model for how journalism could serve democracy by refusing to let important truths remain unspoken. As Marcus looked into the camera, he thought about the Jefferson Davis Elementary School, now climate-controlled and thriving. He thought about Senator Tuberville, who had won re-election on a platform of transparent governance and inclusive representation. And he thought about all the conversations that were happening because someone had finally been willing to break the silence. "Our first guest tonight," Marcus said, "is here to discuss voting rights in Georgia, and we're going to ask the questions that others won't." The silence that had once protected comfortable lies was now filled with the sound of truth being spoken, one difficult conversation at a time.